January 3, 2020, Baghdad International Airport. American intelligence analysts had been tracking a convoy for hours, waiting for confirmation of the passenger's identity, when the vehicles pulled onto the tarmac and a figure in a dark suit emerged to greet arriving delegates from Lebanon. The analysts had their answer. Major General Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's Quds Force, was stepping out of his vehicle in full view of overhead surveillance. According to Iraqi Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi, who spoke to Iraq's parliament 2 days later, Soleimani had traveled to Baghdad on a diplomatic mission, reportedly carrying Iran's response to Saudi messages about reducing regional tensions that Iraq was mediating. Iranian officials later claimed that the United States had encouraged this mediation through back channels, though American officials strongly denied this and dismissed the diplomatic mission claim as Iranian propaganda. Within minutes, an MQ-9 Reaper drone fired precision missiles that killed Soleimani instantly, along with Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, deputy commander of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces. The strike, personally authorized by President Donald Trump, eliminated what American officials considered the second most powerful figure in Iran. This was a man who commanded more actual military force across the Middle East than many heads of state controlled within their own borders. What made this targeted strike extraordinary was not just who Soleimani was, but what he represented and why the United States feared him enough to risk a potential war. He was not merely a general following orders from Tehran. He was a viceroy who personally controlled proxy armies in 4 Arab capitals, who negotiated directly with heads of state, who could start or stop conflicts with a phone call, and who was building a continuous land corridor from Iran to the Mediterranean Sea that would have fundamentally altered the balance of power across the entire region. This raises a question that cuts to the heart of modern power. Before we move, think about this. If you were leading a country and discovered that one of your military commanders had become more powerful than you, controlling armies across multiple nations and making deals with foreign government, would you consider it a threat or be happy with the involvement of the leader? There's no easy answer, and that's exactly the position Iran's presidents found themselves in with Soleimani. To understand how one man accumulated this extraordinary power, we need to go back to where it all began. In 1997 or early 1998, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei appointed Soleimani commander of the Quds Force, the external operations wing of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. When Soleimani took command at age 41, the organization was relatively small, its influence limited primarily to Lebanon's Hezbollah. Over the next 22 years, he would transform it into the most effective unconventional warfare organization in the modern Middle East. Soleimani's background shaped his approach in fundamental ways. Born in 1957 in a poor agricultural village, he began working at age 13 after his father's death. During the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, he rose rapidly through the ranks, leading reconnaissance units behind Iraqi lines and gaining direct experience in unconventional warfare. By the war's end, he had reached brigadier general with a reputation for tactical innovation. This combat experience gave him credibility with militia leaders across the region, and his humble origins allowed him to connect with fighters in ways Tehran's political elite could not. These experiences would prove crucial because Soleimani understood something that other Iranian leaders missed. Iran couldn't win conventional wars, but it could dominate through proxies. Iran could not match American conventional military power directly. Its air force and navy were significantly weaker than regional rivals like Saudi Arabia and Israel, meaning direct confrontation would result in certain defeat. However, Iran possessed ideological influence among Shia populations across the Middle East, financial resources from oil revenues, and geographic position adjacent to unstable states. Soleimani exploited these advantages by building networks of local proxy forces that could advance Iranian interests while allowing Tehran to deny direct involvement. The model already existed in Lebanon, where Iran had helped create Hezbollah during the 1980s. By 2020, Hezbollah had evolved into a highly effective military and political organization that dominated Lebanese politics and, according to intelligence estimates, possessed over 130,000 rockets and missiles. Soleimani's relationship with Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah became the template for building similar organizations elsewhere. The 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel demonstrated that a well-trained proxy force could fight Israel to a stalemate, validating the strategic concept that would guide Soleimani's operations. Lebanon Pentagon proved the model worked. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003 would give him the opportunity to expand this blueprint across the entire Middle East. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003 created a dramatic opportunity. The overthrow of Saddam Hussein's Sunni-dominated government and empowerment of Iraq's Shia majority opened Iraq to Iranian influence in unprecedented ways. Soleimani moved quickly, establishing relationships with Iraqi Shia parties and militias, providing weapons, training, and financial support. The Quds Force trained Iraqi militias in using explosively formed penetrators, roadside bombs particularly effective against American armored vehicles. These weapons, which intelligence officials traced directly to Iranian manufacturing facilities, were responsible for hundreds of American casualties. U.S. military sources attributed approximately 500 to 600 American deaths to Iranian-supplied weapons and training between 2005 and 2011. Beyond attacking American forces, Soleimani built a comprehensive political network. He cultivated relationships with virtually every significant Shia political figure in Iraq, often mediating disputes between rival factions. Iraqi officials described a man who operated more like a head of state than a military officer, giving him influence over Iraqi government decisions that exceeded what many elected Iraqi officials possessed. By 2011, Soleimani had transformed Iraq into an Iranian sphere of influence. When Syria erupted into civil war, everything Iran had built in the region hung in the balance. The Syrian civil war that began in 2011 represented both crisis and opportunity. The uprising against Bashar al-Assad threatened to topple Iran's only formal Arab ally, potentially severing the connection between Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Soleimani recognized Assad's survival as essential and threw the full weight of the Quds Force into saving the Syrian government. He organized a comprehensive military intervention involving thousands of Quds Force advisors, tens of thousands of proxy fighters from across the region, and direct Hezbollah intervention from Lebanon. The Syria operation showcased Soleimani's ability to coordinate multiple proxy forces. He recruited and deployed thousands of Shia fighters from Iraq, convinced Hezbollah to commit fighters despite domestic opposition, and formed the Fatimiyun Brigade from Afghan refugees and the Zainabiyun Brigade from Pakistani fighters. He coordinated with Russian forces after their 2015 intervention. At peak involvement, analysts estimated Soleimani commanded a multinational force of 50,000 to 80,000 fighters from at least 6 countries. While Syria consumed most attention, Soleimani simultaneously opened another front. In Yemen, he saw an opportunity to threaten Saudi Arabia directly. When the Houthi movement began advancing in Yemen in 2014, the Quds Force provided weapons, training, and strategic advice that dramatically enhanced their capabilities. The Houthis had been fighting the Yemeni government intermittently since 2004, but their effectiveness increased dramatically after receiving Iranian support. By 2015, the Houthis possessed missiles and drones that could not have been manufactured locally. Saudi Arabia's coalition failed to dislodge them despite intensive operations, and Houthi missiles began regularly striking deep inside Saudi territory. By 2020, the scope of what Soleimani had built became clear. He had created something unprecedented in modern Middle Eastern history. Soleimani's network gave Iran military influence in 4 Arab capitals. In Baghdad, Iranian-backed militias had been incorporated into Iraq's official security forces. In Damascus, Assad's survival depended on Iranian-backed forces. In Beirut, Hezbollah dominated Lebanon with capabilities exceeding the official Lebanese armed forces. In Sana'a, the Houthis controlled northern Yemen with weapons capable of striking throughout the Arabian Peninsula. This was a coordinated system with Soleimani at its center, making strategic decisions across multiple conflicts simultaneously. But controlling 4 capitals was only part of the vision. The real prize was connecting them into a continuous corridor from Tehran to the Mediterranean. The land bridge referred to continuous territorial control from Iran through Iraq and Syria to Lebanon, creating an unbroken corridor for moving weapons, fighters, and supplies to the Mediterranean. This was the nightmare scenario dominating Pentagon planning since 2015. American strategists recognized that completing this corridor would permanently shift regional power in Iran's favor, potentially making American military presence irrelevant and threatening Israel and Saudi Arabia in ways that couldn't be reversed without major war. By 2019, this corridor was approaching completion. Iraqi and Syrian territory territory between Iran and Lebanon was controlled by governments Iran heavily influenced or by Iranian-backed forces. Only small pockets remained, controlled by Syrian opposition or American forces specifically positioned to prevent the corridor's completion. A completed land bridge would allow Iran to supply proxies by ground rather than air shipments Israel regularly intercepted, position Iranian forces on Israel's border, and create a continuous zone of influence stretching over 1,000 miles. This external power was extraordinary, but what made Soleimani truly unique was how much authority he wielded inside Iran itself. Soleimani's close relationship with Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei gave him direct access to Iran's highest authority and significant autonomy. He briefed Khamenei personally, often bypassing normal chains of command. Iranian presidents, including both reformist and conservative figures, had limited influence over his operations because he answered directly to Khamenei rather than elected government. The question of whether Soleimani was more powerful than Iran's president reveals how the Islamic Republic actually functions versus how it appears. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, who held office from 2013 to 2021, was elected by Iranian voters and theoretically controlled the executive branch. However, Rouhani had no authority over the Revolutionary Guard Corps. On regional security issues, Soleimani's domain, the president's influence was limited primarily to advocacy, while Soleimani could implement policy directly. When conflicts arose between Rouhani's diplomatic approach and Soleimani's military operations, Soleimani's position consistently prevailed because he had Khamenei's backing. This created a situation where Soleimani wielded more actual power in regional affairs than Iran's foreign minister or even its president. By 2019, American officials watching Soleimani's growing power faced a decision. This was no longer just another Iranian commander. The question was no longer whether to act, but when. American intelligence agencies had been monitoring Soleimani's land bridge strategy with growing alarm throughout 2019. According to reporting on internal briefings, assessments presented to President Trump emphasized that Soleimani was the architect of a regional transformation threatening every American ally. Defense officials warned his network had reached critical mass where it could operate independently of American deterrence. Intelligence suggested he was planning coordinated attacks against American diplomatic facilities to force withdrawal from Iraq and Syria. Then came late December 2019 and events that would force Washington's hand. The circumstances that brought Soleimani to Baghdad remain controversial. According to Iraqi Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi, Soleimani was delivering Iran's response to Saudi messages about reducing tensions that Iraq was mediating. Iranian officials claimed the Trump administration had encouraged this mediation through back channels while planning the strike. The United States categorically rejected these claims, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo dismissing the diplomatic mission story. American officials maintained the strike was justified by intelligence indicating Soleimani was planning attacks against American targets. Whatever the truth, what happened when he arrived was not in dispute. In late 2019, Iranian-backed militias launched rocket attacks against Iraqi bases hosting American forces, killing an American contractor on December 27th. The United States responded with airstrikes killing 25 fighters. On December 31st, Iraqi protesters stormed the American embassy compound in Baghdad, breaking through the outer perimeter and setting fires. The protests were organized by the same militia group Soleimani had been cultivating for years. When intelligence indicated Soleimani would travel to Baghdad on January 2nd to meet militia leaders, American officials made the decision to strike. President Trump was presented with several options by his national security team. The option to kill Soleimani himself had been included in previous briefings to other presidents, but had always been rejected as too escalatory. Trump, however, chose the most aggressive option available. The operation was carried out by Joint Special Operations Command, with an MQ-9 Reaper drone tracking Soleimani's convoy from Baghdad International Airport. The missiles fired hit with such precision that they killed Soleimani, al-Muhandis, and several other figures as they departed the airport. Iran's supreme leader vowed severe revenge and declared 3 days of mourning. Millions participated in funeral ceremonies in Tehran and Soleimani's home province of Kerman, where a stampede during the funeral procession killed 56 people as massive crowds gathered to honor the slain commander. On January 8th, Iran launched ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi bases hosting American forces. The strikes demonstrated Iranian technical capabilities but caused no American deaths, partly because the U.S. received advance warning. Over 100 service members were later diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries, but the lack of fatalities suggested Iran carefully measured its response to satisfy domestic demands while avoiding American casualties that would require further military action. The immediate crisis passed without triggering wider war, but the real question was what would happen to the network Soleimani had built. Soleimani's death removed the central coordinator who had maintained unity across multiple proxy forces. His successor, Esmail Ghani, lacked his charisma and personal relationships. The proxy forces continued operating, but coordination became less effective. Iraqi militia leaders noted Ghani approached relationships more like business deals, lacking Soleimani's ability to inspire loyalty. The land bridge strategy continued, but implementation became fragmented as groups pursued divergent interests. American strategy had focused on Soleimani personally, based on assessment that his death would disrupt the network more than attacking individual groups. He had been the glue holding together diverse militias with different interests. Iraqi militias had local agendas. Hezbollah prioritized Lebanese politics. Assad focused on regime survival. Houthis pursued Yemeni objectives. They cooperated because Soleimani convinced them their interests aligned with Iran's. The difference became clear. The network survived but no longer functioned as a unified system. The strategic assessment that led to Soleimani's assassination reflected American recognition that he represented something unprecedented in modern Middle Eastern politics. A military commander who functioned as a regional power broker independent of traditional state structures. He negotiated with heads of state as an equal, made strategic decisions affecting multiple countries, and commanded forces larger than many national armies. According to reporting on classified briefings, American intelligence assessments concluded that Soleimani personally was more dangerous than the proxy forces he commanded because he was the only figure capable of coordinating action across all of Iran's regional networks simultaneously. Sources familiar with CIA Director Gina Haspel's congressional briefings reported that she characterized Soleimani as Iran's most valuable strategic asset, worth more to Iranian regional power than any weapon system or military installation. Defense officials reportedly warned that his operational creativity and personal relationships with militia commanders made him uniquely capable of orchestrating attacks that Iran's regular military or other Quds Force commanders could never execute. Based on these assessments, the fear was not just what Soleimani had already built, but what he would build next, if left unchecked, leading American officials to conclude that his death would significantly degrade Iranian capabilities in ways that striking infrastructure or proxy forces would not. Whether this assessment was correct remains debated among analysts, with some arguing that the structures Soleimani built were more important than the individual, and others maintaining that his unique combination of strategic vision, operational capability, and personal relationships made him irreplaceable. The question of whether Soleimani was more powerful than Iran's president deserves serious examination because it reveals important aspects of how the Islamic Republic actually functions versus how its formal constitutional structures appear. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, who held office from 2013 to 2021, was elected by Iranian voters and theoretically controlled the executive branch of government, including the foreign ministry and significant portions of the economy. However, Rouhani had no authority over the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which answers directly to the supreme leader. On regional security issues, which were Soleimani's domain, the president's influence was limited primarily to advocacy within regime councils, while Soleimani could implement policy directly through the forces he commanded. When conflicts arose between Rouhani's diplomatic approach and Soleimani's military operations, Soleimani's position consistently prevailed because he had Khamenei's backing. Multiple instances occurred where Soleimani undermined negotiations that Rouhani's government was pursuing using proxy attacks or military operations to demonstrate Iranian strength in ways that complicated diplomatic efforts. Rouhani could not override these operations because Soleimani did not report to him. The comparison to a viceroy, a term used by several analysts to describe Soleimani's role, captures important aspects of his actual power. Historical viceroys were personal representatives of sovereigns who exercised royal authority in distant territories, often with significant autonomy to make decisions without consulting the monarch. Soleimani functioned similarly as Khamenei's personal representative across the Middle East, exercising Iranian power through proxy forces and networks while operating with considerable independence in tactical and operational decisions. He had authority to commit Iranian resources, make promises on behalf of the Iranian state, and undertake military operations based on his assessment of circumstances rather than requiring approval for each action. This level of delegated authority was unusual in the Islamic Republic's normally careful and committee-driven decision-making process, reflecting both Khamenei's trust in Soleimani and recognition that effective unconventional warfare required giving field commanders significant autonomy. The land bridge strategy that Soleimani pursued represented a coherent vision for transforming Iran from a besieged regional power into the dominant force across a vast territory. Completion of continuous territorial control from Iran to the Mediterranean would have accomplished several strategic objectives simultaneously. It would have secured reliable supply routes to Hezbollah and other Lebanese proxies, dramatically increasing the weapons and equipment that could be delivered. It would have positioned Iranian forces on Israel's border, fundamentally altering the military balance. It would have demonstrated Iranian power projection capabilities in ways that would enhance deterrence against American or Israeli attack. Beyond military advantages, it would have created economic opportunities through control of trade routes and reconstruction in Syria and Iraq. Most importantly, it would have established Iran as the dominant regional power in the Middle East, surpassing Saudi Arabia and potentially rivaling Turkey's regional influence. American strategy in response to this vision focused heavily on Soleimani personally, rather than just on the proxy forces he commanded, based on assessment that his death would disrupt the network more effectively than attacks on individual proxy groups. This personalization of strategy reflected recognition that Soleimani had become the glue holding together a diverse coalition of Shia militias, political parties, and government factions that had different interests and priorities. Iraqi militias had local political agendas distinct from Tehran's regional goals. Hezbollah prioritized Lebanese domestic politics and confrontation with Israel, while Assad focused on Syrian regime survival. The Houthis pursued Yemeni objectives in confrontation with Saudi Arabia. These groups cooperated because Soleimani convinced them that their interests aligned with Iran's, using both financial incentives and personal relationships to maintain unity. His death removed the primary coordinator who could mediate disputes, allocate resources based on overall strategy, and maintain focus on regional objectives rather than local interests. The aftermath demonstrated both the extent and limits of what Soleimani built. Proxy forces continued operating and even increased attacks in some cases, showing the basic structure survived. However, strategic coherence decreased as groups pursued their own priorities without effective central direction. The land bridge remained incomplete as of 2024, with American forces still present in eastern Syria and Israeli airstrikes regularly targeting Iranian weapons shipments. Iranian influence in Iraq remained strong, but became more contested as Iraqi nationalism reasserted itself and militias increasingly pursued independent agendas. The system proved durable enough to survive Soleimani's death, but not dynamic enough to continue expanding without his personal leadership. The figure of Qasem Soleimani represents a specific type of power that emerged from the particular circumstances of early 21st century Middle Eastern politics. The collapse of state authority in Iraq and Syria, the sectarian nature of regional conflicts, American military interventions that destabilized existing orders, and Iran's strategic decision to pursue influence through proxy forces rather than conventional military power all created space for a figure like Soleimani to operate. He was more than a general because he wielded political and economic power across multiple countries. He was less than a head of state because he lacked formal sovereignty and operated through proxy forces rather than state institutions. This ambiguous position gave him significant advantages in asymmetric conflicts, where formal state structures were often liabilities rather than assets, but it also meant that his power depended on personal relationships and continuous active management rather than institutionalized authority that would automatically transfer to a successor. This brings us back to the question posed at the beginning. When a military commander becomes more powerful than the political leaders he serves, when he commands forces across multiple countries and negotiates as a head of state, has he crossed the line from general to something else entirely? Soleimani's story suggests the answer is yes, but it also reveals the limits of that transformation. The question of whether Soleimani was building something genuinely new or simply exploiting temporary conditions remains unresolved. Some analysts argue that the proxy network represented a sustainable model for Iranian power projection that would outlast any individual commander. Others maintain that the system was fundamentally dependent on the specific conditions of the 2010s. Those conditions included American military presence that created grievances Iran could exploit, weak Arab governments that provided opportunities for Iranian influence, and an environment where proxy operations could occur without triggering overwhelming responses. The ultimate test of these competing interpretations will be whether Iranian regional influence persists, expands, or contracts in the years following Soleimani's death. The answer will reveal whether he built institutions that would endure or whether he was personally the essential element holding together an otherwise unstable coalition.